We know this is an issue that divides much of the country, depending on where you live, and maybe even divides people living in the same household. But I think we have found some areas where there's space for compromise. And we've also found that there are some red lines and no middle ground.
Texas Republican John Cornyn was talking about the bipartisan gun bill making its way through Congress right now. But he could have been referring to all sorts of issues. And as you may already know, this deep political divide even impacts who we hang out with. About 2/3 of Republicans and Democrats say their core friend groups are mostly people in their own political party. So how do we pull the country back together? With us tonight to discuss, Nick Troiano, Executive Director of Unite America, a national organization trying to bridge the growing partisan divide with political reforms and candidates who put people over party. Nick, I'm so excited to have this conversation because millions of Americans consider themselves centrists. But the way our two parties are structured, specifically our primaries, we keep pushing further to the right, further to the left, and away from the millions of Americans that are in the center. Is there a way to solve for this?
There is, Stephanie. I think we spend a lot of time focused on who we elect, not enough time focusing on how we elect, because it's the systems of our elections that are really pushing our parties further and further apart. And I think our politicians, as a result, are much more polarized than we the people. We're not seeing the type of solutions and bipartisan policymaking in Congress as the American people want and deserve. And the core reason of that is because of our system of partisan primaries. You know, in the last election, it was only 10% of Americans who elected 83% of Congress, because the vast majority of our elections are decided not in the general election in November, but in the primary election. And that problem is getting even worse this election cycle after the latest round of redistricting. We're going to have the least competitive elections of our lifetime. It's going to lead to the least accountable Congress of our lifetime. So if we want different outcomes out of Congress, we have to change the process. And fortunately, there's a growing movement to do that at the state level all across the country.
Well, talk us through it, because Unite America has 4 suggestions for election reform: more competitive districts, viable choices, independent voters, and accessible voting. All of these on paper sound like great, 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 great. But how does any of that actually become a reality?
Well, I'll give you the best example, which is what's happening in Alaska. In fact, Senator Murkowski was one of the 14 Republicans who voted to advance the bipartisan gun legislation. She's the only Republican up for election this year. And what's notable is that this is the first time where the senator doesn't face a partisan primary. She's standing for election in front of all Alaskan voters, because in 2020, Alaskans adopted a ballot measure that replaced both parties' primaries with a single nonpartisan primary. So all the candidates compete in one election. All the voters get to participate on that ballot. The top 4 finishers go to the general election, and through an instant runoff, whomever wins a majority of support gets elected. And so it gives voters more voice and choice in elections, and it incentivizes candidates and leaders to campaign and be responsive to the whole constituency, not just the 10% who may vote in a partisan primary. Now imagine if additional states were to adopt this reform, we can have dozens of our elected leaders in Congress finally being able to be responsive to the majority of Americans and not the political extremes.
Nick, the operative word here is imagine. Alaska is literally and figuratively really, really far away. What is the likelihood and the timeline of this happening in more states?
Well, the good news is that in close to half the states, they have ballot initiative processes available. So citizens can literally petition to get this change on the ballot to go right to the voters. And more states are working on it. I would keep an eye on Nevada, which may have an opportunity to vote on this come November. And citizens can organize in other states that have this available to them. And also we can organize to pressure our lawmakers and state legislatures around the country to adopt these reforms, because our Constitution gives us that ability. It allows the states to determine the time, place, and manner of their elections. What's incumbent upon us is to realize that instead of fighting each other in these daily political battles, let's join forces together to fix the system. Because we don't have to all agree on policy and all the issues of the day, but we can agree that the extremism has gone too far, big problems aren't getting solved, and we don't deserve elections that are simply between the lesser of two evils. If we join forces across the political spectrum and demand these changes, Stephanie, I think big change can happen rather soon.
Has it gone so far that finally a third party will really emerge in a significant way? For years and years, we've said this makes sense. But now we talk all the time. Can't these parties get along? Can't they just fit under one big tent? Why should they have to? Why should someone like AOC, who has an extraordinary platform and deep beliefs, why should she have to conform and get on board with a centrist when they're far, far, far from what she represents? Is this a moment where you're actually going to see things change?
Well, it goes back to the challenges of our electoral system. You know, a majority of Americans are now independent. Over 60% would like to see new competition to both parties, but we are unlikely to get that until we change the rules of the game. Because right now, take it from me, I ran as an independent for Congress in 2014, and the number one challenge you face is that voters who want to support you fear that doing so would be a wasted vote or would spoil the election and elect their least preferred candidate. A system like ranked choice voting or instant runoff voting can remove that spoiler effect and allow voters to vote their true preference. So states like Maine have already adopted it statewide. States like Utah and Virginia and Colorado are beginning to experiment with this at a more local level. These are the electoral reforms that need to be in place in order for new competition to emerge and in order for voters to get the kind of government they deserve.
Ranked choice voting. Elect someone you actually like. Novel idea. Nick Troiano, thank you for joining us. Please, please come back soon. We need to educate our audience with what you're doing and why it could really make a difference. Coming up.